And we are streaming.
Wow.
Welcome to the Q&A, the one you've all been waiting for with Josh Basse. Who even is Josh
Hello.
Basse, Marty? Do you want to introduce our new Q&A host?
Um, sure. That's why I'm here. So yeah, this month, what was it, January? Well, last year when we went on sabbatical, we started dripping some vision that we wanted to get the rest of the co-hosts on these live streams. So it wasn't just me and Brent. And so we started in January. We got L. Grover Fricks on here. And then we took a couple months back to normal with me. And then we mentioned that Josh was coming on this month, and we'll get Reed on soon. Reed is the last one. We'll get him on. My original plan was to have Reed join us in July, but I just found out he's on sabbatical this summer. So we'll see if he wants to do that or if he wants to wait till the fall. And then you'll be stuck with me, or you will get Elle back on here or something. Who knows? But what we did in January is we introduced Elle because um, a lot of people haven't gotten to session 6 yet, a lot. And so they don't even know. But eventually in season 6, Brent and I do what we probably should have done a long time before. And that is that we added some teachers to the team so that it wasn't just one or two voices, but it was a handful of voices with different passions and perspectives and gift sets. And it was this beautiful thing that has just been going ever since we did that in season 6. And and so we wanted to introduce even those that haven't gotten to season 6. We wanted you to meet everybody, meet the team. So that's what we're doing. We're actually, can we talk about our secret project, Brent, or not?
Is it a secret? I'm pretty sure we've already talked about it.
We've talked about it elsewhere. We are working on a reboot of actually seasons 1 through 5, and there's a lot of reasons why we're doing that. Brent and I have actually already recorded a couple of those reboot episodes. We're probably going to launch those later this year. But one of the reasons that we are doing that is to let people get introduced to the co-hosts earlier in the journey than season 6. We want them right up in the front in season 1 to meet these names and faces. So that's why that project is there. But just a little bit about Josh, and then I'll get out of here. I'll turn it over to Brent for some details, and I'll disappear like I did in January. Hopefully with less snark in a Google Doc that shall not be named. Um, I gave Elle a real hard time all live stream in January, so I'll try not to do that this time. But Josh, one of the things I loved about Josh, I've known Josh in different capacities for years, and then Josh started working with Impact, which was beautiful. Like his wife Sophia is one of my first alumni, like literally one of my first students I ever had in campus ministry, and she lived in the Bayma house, and then she got married to Josh, and Josh was very adjacent to the things that we were doing. And then he decides he wants to come to Cincinnati. He actually beat me here. He got to Cincinnati a year before I did. And but what I loved about Josh, after we started working together, I got to discover this even more and more deeply. We would go on these walks together and just have these
Oh
deep
yeah.
theological conversations. And he was very concrete on one hand, but he was very like he just had a fresh, different way of looking at things. I always use the word mystical, and that kind of freaks people out. But he has this like more, I don't know, spirit connected perspective. But then you put that aside, and Josh is probably one of the people like close in my life that I could talk to on a daily basis that has this deep understanding of midrash, of Jewish tradition, of all that stuff. And like his voice was just such an easy, when I started thinking, who would I add to the podcast? It was like, well, Josh has not just the knowledge and the familiarity and an appreciation, but he also brings something fresh and unique that a Reed and a Marty and a Brent and an L they simply don't bring. And I love having Josh in the room. I love having him in the podcast. He's pastoral. Like I could just do this for like 30 minutes. I should probably stop. But Josh is like pastoral. He cares deeply. What did I hear this week, Josh? I heard something. Somebody said this yesterday. You haven't even heard this yet. Oh, I
Oh
remember
my.
who it was. There's a staff member on Impact, and they said when I think of the word compassion, Josh Bosse's face, and only Josh Bosse is the person that I think about. So that's
Holy moly.
beautiful, and you probably feel like you don't deserve that, but you do, and it's just wonderful. So many things that I love about Josh. So there you go. That's my introduction to Josh. He's a teacher, one of five on the Bayma teaching team at this point, and I introduced you, Josh Bosse.
Well, thank you. I was not expecting all that. Holy smokes.
A proper introduction, I would say. Just a little bit of
Yeah.
housekeeping. The next Q&A is Thursday, May 16th, so you can add that to your calendar. Of course, it's on the website, bamondiscipleship.com, on the news tab. And we are currently streaming to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We have viewers on all of them at this moment, so everything seems to be working. I will be flagging any questions that come in, and we'll be incorporating as many of those as possible. We have a number of pre-submitted ones. Some of them are somewhat old because they are ones that we have specifically set aside for Josh to address. We thought that he would be particularly suited to talk about it and think about it, or maybe it's just stuff that we've talked about many times before, and so we're getting a new perspective. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
that. So there are too many questions, though. In most cases, the last few months especially, we have not come anywhere close to getting through everything. So we're going to do our best. We're going to get through these pre-selected questions. We're going to take some live questions, and we'll do what we can. But we'll be here for a couple hours, just mulling things over and learning how to think and learning how to ask new and better questions, and hopefully exchanging some ideas that we've never thought about before. Lots of fun times ahead. So Marty, thank you for joining us from the road, from an
Mhm.
unusual location. It worked out, a little bit of echo, but a glorious stained glass window. So I think it, on the whole, balances out. If you want to give us some lasers, we'll get you out of here. All right, Josh, over to you.
Heck yeah. All right. Wow. What an introduction. Does everyone get this treatment? Well, I guess it's only been L. Did L get this kind of treatment? My goodness. I felt like when, like, back in the olden times, people would be like introduced by, like, Richard, the Slayer of Men and King of 10,000. Like, that was, I'm still kind of reeling from that. Man, thank you, Marty. Thank you, Brent. I'm so excited to dig into some of these questions and to talk with you. I think Marty said this, but it's really very true. I am a teacher, and one of the difficulties of being on the podcast is that it's a one-way medium. I can't see any of the people I'm teaching. I can't see the light bulb go off. I can't hear any feedback or follow-up questions. And that really bugs me. And this isn't quite as close as a classroom, but it's a lot closer. And that excites me. So I'm really interested in what kind of questions are going to come up live. And so if you have heard me on the podcast, you'll know that I can be a little long-winded. And I've heard that this thing goes about 2 hours, which is has sometimes been the length of a single podcast episode. So, in order to make sure that I don't go that long on every question, I'll either give like an in-depth answer, or I might just give a quick answer, and that's not. I'm not trying to skim over any very important questions. Just I gotta rein myself in. So if I give a short answer to your question, I hope that doesn't offend anyone. Um, and thankfully, the first couple pre-prepared questions we have are pretty simple. The first one, this is, as they said, uh, some of these are from a while ago. So this is from Matthew from a little under a year ago. I'm currently in seminary, and I'm wanting to do my master's thesis on the different schools of thought that Jesus and the writers of the New Testament were interacting with. like Hillel and Shammai? What are some good resources to get me started? Now, the honest answer is that I don't know. I am, you've heard a lot about my skill set and my praises. One of the big holes in my knowledge base and my skill set is history. I'm just really not good with history. So knowing the specific conversation going on at that time, I don't got a clue. I don't tend to read those kinds of books. But my wonderful and very much more academic and history-minded Talmud, Ben Casperson, I asked him, because he has done a ton of reading about first century Judaism and the whole rabbinic conversation at that time. So he gave me a list of some of his favorite books he's read there. Although, and if you have any follow-up questions on this, Matthew, you can always go to the Slack and message Ben. I'm sure he would love to talk with you about this. And anywho, let me just get to the book. So the first one is Jewish Sources in Early Christianity by David Flusser, which I have read Flusser before. Flusser's incredible. Really like Flusser. He does a really good job, from what I've read, of balancing like an academic lens, but still taking the spiritual qualities inherent to talking about Jesus and Judaism and these things. He takes them very seriously, and that I really like the way he struck that balance. And anyway, Jewish Sources in Early Christianity, according to Ben, it goes a lot into just the kind of the Second Temple sources, like what Christians at that time were interacting with. Second book is Roots of Rabbinic Judaism by Gabriel Boccaccini. Two double C's there. Boccaccini. Hope I didn't murder that person's name. Apparently this one is very academic, and it kind of talks about the things that preceded the whole rabbinic conversation in Judaism, the conversations that grew into the Second Temple rabbinic discourse that was going on in Jesus's time. So it talks about kind of the stuff happening a little bit before that, leading into it. And the third book is The Bible as It Was by James L. Kugel, and goes into a lot of depth analyzing different Second Temple writings and their interpretations of the Torah. So it goes into like even like Book of Enoch type stuff, New Testament stuff. Seems like a very, very interesting book. I myself might want to read it. But anyway, Matthew, you've been doing this your master's thesis for a while. I hope this has come just in the nick of time and not months too late. But, those are some good resources if anyone's got that academic itch. All right. I'm going to move on to the next question now. This one, also nearly a year old, comes to us from Keitha. Hello, Keitha. I hope you're listening. Keitha asks, can you give me your thoughts on Hebrews 7:10? What is your understanding of still in his ancestor's body? So for those who are not familiar with this passage, haven't read Hebrews recently, this is in general where the author of Hebrews is talking about the priesthood of Jesus that is in the order of Melchizedek, who he refers to, Melchizedek, this priest, this person that strangely doesn't have any background. We're not told any genealogical information about Melchizedek in Genesis. And we were told he's a priest. His name means king of righteousness. We're taught that it says in the Torah that he ruled over a place called Shalem, which is connected to the word shalom. And so a lot of that context, but we don't know where he came from. And the author of Hebrews makes note of the fact that Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek, while Levi, let's see, what would that be? Levi, the son of Jacob, who is Abraham's grandson. So his great-grandson will end up being Levi, the person who ultimately all the priests come from. So he's making a point that even the at root the Levitical priesthood that takes all the tithes and uses them in the temple and redistributes them, all the stuff we talk about with priests, that their ancestor Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, this person we don't know where he comes from. He's just a priest, seems to be a priest of God, although strangely he talks about God in a different way than we've seen before in the text. I won't get tied up in the Melchizedek stuff. Really though, the author of Hebrews says, while basically Levi was still in his ancestor's body, i.e. in Abraham's body, he was tithing to someone else. And so that is basically a euphemism that even persists today. It can be a little crude, so I won't say it on stream, but of that, like, I guess we could say in a modern scientific context that like Levi's DNA, the base materials that will eventually become all the priesthood, were still in Abraham's body. They hadn't gone out and become real people. And anywho, so that's what that euphemism or that phrase means. It's still in Abraham's body, hasn't become an actual person yet. And yeah, that's all I have to say about that. I could get going on Melchizedek, but I don't know. Maybe we'll circle back around. And let's see here. So the next question I have is a little bit longer. So I'm not going to be able to read the whole thing, but this is coming to us from Thomas, who really appreciates the podcast. That's like the first whole chunk of his message, and it's always so great to hear how this has impacted people, especially with what Thomas talks about here in regarding to like feeling free to unlearn some things and explore other things. And in particular, he was sharing a teaching that he felt very strongly about Jacob and his chutzpah. And specifically, he wanted to share a reading of Yaakov, of Jacob's, the wrestling that kind of characterizes his whole life, and that specifically reading Jacob's blessing that he receives from Isaac as something that he stole and therefore wasn't actually meant for him, and that ended up kind of haunting Yaakov, and that ultimately that tension breaks out when Yaakov is wrestling this mysterious character at night, and it seems like this interpretation you're bringing here, Thomas, is coming from the idea that he doesn't let his wrestling partner go until they bless him. He says that explicitly. He says, "I won't let you go until you bless me." And Thomas is taking that to say like, oh, the previous blessing he got, it wasn't enough, or rather it didn't fit him, it wasn't meant for him, and so there was something not right there, and that was this like raw need that is being passionately expressed by Jacob, wrestling with God and saying like, I'm not going to let go until you give me a real blessing that's for me. Now, and then this blessing from God ends up becoming his wholeness, and this is where he gets renamed Israel. And I can totally see that reading. I will say, for me personally, and this is actually something you can all learn about me, is that I am a big fan of Yaakov. I think in a lot of ways Yaakov gets done dirty, and is really sometimes oversimplified. And I don't know, I think some of that goes back to all the way to, was it episode -1, where Marty talks about the Western versus Eastern relationship with truth. Because anyway, Yaakov definitely doesn't follow our strict Western idea of truthfulness, but I have a big soft spot for Yaakov. So I will take a position of disagreeing with this interpretation, although I think it's wonderful that you feel more free, Thomas, to read the Bible in these new ways. I'm gonna say I feel like I don't like this because I think that um, one, that the idea that Yaakov made an error that he's like paying for his whole life is a little bit of an incorrect oversimplification. Um, and here's what I mean by that. So we have this tension in the household where we have Yaakov, we have Esau, two different sons, and they're fighting from the very before they even come out of the womb. We know they're fighting, and then they come out of the womb, and Yaakov's name comes from him literally fighting Esau to be first. And we see through the incident where with the stew that Esau, it says explicitly in Torah that he spurns the birthright. He does not see his role as the Bechor, his role as, which we have to remember is not just the normal status of being Bechor, but being the Bechor in the context of being the family of God on God's mission, being God's partner. So at some level, the text is telling us Esau isn't interested in that. Yaakov is very interested in that. And so we have this tension, and God even speaks to this. Uh, Rebecca asks God about this, and God tells her straight up, the older will serve the younger. The birth order will be flipped, which is a big trope in Genesis, especially, but throughout the whole Torah, the whole Tanakh. And when to me, I look at this as Yaakov being dealt a rough hand and having to take care of it in the way he was able to. But, and I won't get too bogged down in it, because like I said, this is something I'm passionate about, so I could really go overboard here. I'm not going to go overboard. I'll keep it simple. The idea that, Yaakov made this error in how he went about getting the blessing, and that haunted him for the rest of his life. Like, first of all, that like I kind of don't like that off the jump, because it really just feels like a very no grace sort of read of his story. And that whole episode is so weird as well, with his mom being involved and there being this prophecy that, like, does Isaac know about the prophecy God gave to Rivka? I don't know. But in truth, here's why I really don't like it. There's one character in Yaakov's story who specifically pins what is happening to him, the struggles he goes through, as being because of what he did with Esau. And that character is Laban. When Laban deceives him, what Laban says is, "Oh, don't you know that the eldest has to be married first?" Like, that's his way of getting out of the fact that he, literally lied to Yaakov's face, even though they're family, even though, they should be on good terms with each other. And he throws back this idea of the oldest being first, and very clearly, like, needling Yaakov on this issue of, like, I know what you did. And to me, it's like, man, I don't like a reading that lines up with Laban, with Lavan. He's a total dirtbag. So for me, I look at that and I'm like, man, that doesn't feel right. But here's the other big thing is that, if when Yaakov is wrestling with, we often read this as being God, but there is room in the text to be uncertain of who it is, which is why I'm going to keep it vague for my own reading. Whoever Yaakov is wrestling with, that wrestling is characteristic of Yaakov's whole story. And when God renames Yaakov to Israel, God is commemorating that moment as like the typifying, the characterization of Yaakov's whole story, and is kind of like, I think we have to understand that as something God is acknowledging as a positive. And when I think of someone, this other reading of Yaakov being a person who's just been haunted by this choice he made, that is like following him, like Thomas's specific words is it became ash in his mouth, and he's now like clinging on to God, saying like, give me a blessing, like that. I don't know. That doesn't sound like I don't see what the moment of repentance would be. What's the heart change moment that now leads to God treating Yaakov differently? That's what I don't get. Now, Thomas, I do want to say a couple really positive things. You did say one thing about how he, in the moment of the deception of Isaac, when he receives the blessing, how he literally puts on the skin of his brother in a sense. And I think this is great. I love, and I think that does tie into what you talk about with identity crisis. Like, I'm not saying that's not there. That is absolutely there. There's massive identity crisis stuff in Yaakov's story. And I think we also see that kind of carry on a little bit with Yosef. But nevertheless, with Yaakov here, like I think what would be really interesting to do with that detail is to think about maybe the first time we see someone putting on clothing made of skin, someone who is clothed. Oh, I don't know why I'm being around the bush. Go back to Genesis 3. Being clothed in skin seems like there might be something there, and I had never caught that specific detail before. That kind of leapt out at me as I was reading your question, Thomas. So great question. Great digging. We can disagree on Yaakov, and that's fine. I'm always going to go to bat for my boy. I love Yaakov. It's one of my, it's hard because I like Avraham so much. How can you not love Avraham? He's such a classic, but Yaakov is my dude. I love him. And also, if you look at the rabbinic stuff, they say that Yaakov is the embodiment of truth. Now that's something y'all can chew on. And here's Brent Billings. Hello, Brent.
Sorry, I thought you were done, and then you went on to another
No, no, no.
thought.
I
This
was
is
wrapping
gonna.
up.
Okay, all right, all right. Well, I was just gonna say, Doreen is asking who's more long-winded, you or Reed? And I think for whatever reason, Reed has held on to that reputation, but I think the numbers show that really you are the king. But I would just like to say you're exercising great restraint so far, and we're doing great on time.
Yes,
So.
that's awesome.
Also, Dave says, feel free to be a little crude. I don't know if Dave necessarily speaks for everyone, but he's okay if you wanted to, be
Yes.
a little more explicit on those terms, but I think people got the
It,
idea.
it
So,
probably is more explicit in the Hebrew now that I'm thinking about it, because they
mm,
were actually, I mean, the author of Hebrews, I'm assuming, spoke Hebrew. So, anyway, there's a
we
word
would
that means
assume so.
soft parts that's just like, belly, groin, insides, intestines, all that stuff. So it kind of becomes a catch all for some of those terms. But anywho,
Hmm.
I love that who is it, Dave? I love that Dave feels comfortable with me being crude. Unfortunately, there are other people that I'm accountable to. And
Who knows? Who knows who's
maybe if
watching
we
this?
yeah, who knows who's watching it? Maybe it's just a bunch of people who are, well, yeah, anyway.
All right, well,
Restraint.
I'll let you get back to questions, but I did throw a live question in for the next one just to
Yeah.
start sprinkling those in.
Mm, yes. Yes. Ooh, okay. uh so this comes from delineated. I love the little portmanteau here. I assume your name is Dylan. Anywho, here's the question. Without asking why Jesus died, what's the difference in our ability to follow Jesus's commands and teachings, like love your enemy, before his death and resurrection versus after versus post Pentecost? And I think those are great, great questions, all of them. So I think I think first of all, we gotta step back a little bit and talk about the whole idea of obedience, not just to Jesus, but of God's people obeying God writ large across the whole story, from beginning to end. And I think this is important because this is kind of tied into even like the appearance of Jesus. Like, where does Jesus step into the story? He steps in right after, historically speaking, I mean, not literally immediately after, but right after the return from Babylon, which is where we see the first like major, like total cultural, communal work towards seriously following Torah. This is where the Talmud happened. The whole rabbinic thing happened in that kind of uh, the Babylonian exile. That was where that first took shape. And isn't it funny that right after uh, the Jewish people in exile start really, really devoting themselves to, like, en masse to the study and practice of Torah, that very shortly after Jesus comes. And to me, when we step back and look at the whole time leading up to then, and these cycles of exile and return, these cycles of punishment, of repentance, of the repentance cycle we talk about in Judges, like, it isn't that individual people are unable to follow or not follow. Like, we have, we've talked about in the podcast, there's your Boazes out there, and they're not even all just Jewish people. You have, of course, the very famous ones. You have Ruth, you have Rahab. Um, there are all sorts of people that are doing it right. I mean, that goes back to what we talk about in the podcast of why did God call Avram? Like, it was because Avram did something that God looked at and said, "Oh, that's my dude. That is the kind of love that I can work with. That's the kind of like gut instinct for compassion and taking care of others that I can work with." Um, and at the same time, we see God speaking into people's context where they're at, and that's where we see things like, the whole the laws of the blood avenger, right? Where if someone accidentally kills a member of your family, like, it's an accident, there's no legal issues, like, it's been, people have looked at it, they've said, hey, this was totally an accident, whatever reparations that might need to be made are taken care of. But you still can't get over the fact that this guy is the reason why your cousin or your brother or sister isn't alive anymore, and you would go out and try to kill that person in revenge. And God doesn't say don't do that anymore. God says, hey, let's create these cities of refuge. These cities of refuge also happen to be where the Levites are. And so, and throughout the rabbinic commentaries, there's this understanding that the reason why, you have this whole chase, running around chasing this person, trying to kill them before they get to the city, all those sorts of things. We could look at that and say, why did God not just tell them to knock it off? And I think we have to go back to, how does God see us? And for me, like, there's kind of two images that God always returns to: parent and child, and partnership, right? Whether marriage or otherwise. And when I think of how, like, a parent teaches a child, like, you know, uh, I mean, there's good and bad parents, of course, but this idea of, accepting that a child is where they're at, and you're going to have to communicate in ways that make sense to them for them to move forward. And then later on, you can add some more nuance and context and say, hey, like, well, the street isn't inherently dangerous. You just need to look both ways, and you need to have a proper understanding that cars could be coming by and they may not see you. It doesn't mean that the street is literally a place of imminent death that's dangerous at all points. Like, that's what you have to tell a 3-year-old who likes running around and not looking where they're going. So all that to say, like I feel like this question of uh I love the way you've asked about our ability to follow, because there are changes in what we are able to do. And especially when we take into account that a lot of the things that the Torah says, a lot of the things that Jesus says are things that happen on a communal level. And we cannot just flip a switch for ourselves. Like, I cannot make a change to do that. Like, so my next series on the podcast is going to be about Shabbat, and it's going to be very practically oriented. And one of the hardest things about the practice of Shabbat is that it's really hard to do when you're not in community with, or in a community that also practices not only a Shabbat at the same time, but also like practices a Shabbat in the same way, in a way that can still be communal. Like, there's so much there that is more difficult for us in our in our current context, because it's like, hey, we live in this capitalist world where you don't live where your community is, you live where you can afford to live. Maybe you pick a place because of the school district, or the cost, or how long of a commute it is, or the view. Like, those are the reasons why you choose a house. And you can also choose to live close to your friends, but it's not very common for you to live like alongside all your friends and neighbors and all that stuff. And coming from a culture where that is how human communities were organized in time and space, means that we have like we just have different a difference in our ability to make something like Shabbat happen. So now, to get to your question, Dylan, and in fact, this is a really perfect question for your name, because we are delineating these things. So I think there are the short, simple, straightforward answer to your question is just going to be, in general, it depends. So something like something very straightforward, like don't murder people, like that's going to be generally about as easy. I think there aren't as many changes, but I what I really think, um the crux here is that uh through and I love that you added the Pentecost aspect in here, not just before and after Jesus' death, but also bringing in this idea of the Spirit, of God's presence being with us as intimately as Jesus's incarnation, but at the same time less tangibly. I mean, completely less tangibly than Jesus's very tangible existence. And what does that do for us? So this reminds me of Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well, where he says, hey, you know what? This temple thing ain't going to last too much longer. And this whole bickering, this whole religious debate that exists between the Jews and the Samaritans about where to worship is going to become a non-issue totally. I mean, that's another great reason where we can look and say that our ability to follow Jesus' teachings is gonna vary just based on what things still exist in our world. When there's like, if you go through the Torah, all the vast majority of, like, say, the cleanliness laws, the real reason why cleanliness is important, other than just in the modern sense of not spreading germs and things like that, but spiritually speaking, the place where the uncleanliness laws, where the rubber meets the road for those, is in not bringing uncleanliness into the temple. Because technically there's nothing wrong with being unclean. It's not a moral thing. If a woman's on her period, um if you've been taking care of your neighbor who has leprosy or something, like, those aren't bad things, far from it. But it would be a time where you're not going out and participating in these big public spaces, and it'd be a little bit like like when you're, if you had COVID in the last couple of years, you're going to be staying home and not going out and that sort of thing. But aside from those practical things, the real issue about not passing it on and telling people like, oh, I'm unclean, don't come near me. The reason is so that they don't take your uncleanliness and then bring it to the temple. So now that we have no temple, it's like, well, those issues just aren't as relevant. They aren't as in play. So there's a lot of complexity and nuance in this question. But to get down to what I hear is the heart of the question. What does Jesus's death and resurrection, and then what does the Spirit do? So this is where this isn't a very like well researched answer. I'm just going to be speaking from the heart here. So back to the woman at the well. What does Jesus say? We won't be arguing about where to worship. We'll be worshiping in spirit and in truth. And I love that combination. In spirit and in truth. And in John, which I've taught in this, there's a couple episodes where I talk about the Spirit when we're doing our John series. So I've spoken a lot about it there, and I'll try not to totally just plagiarize myself because that's already recorded. You can go hear my thoughts on that. But there is almost like the concept of the Spirit as something that is not just felt in these particular moments by particular people, which is a little bit more how it kind of seems in Tanakh. But this idea of having the Spirit as a primary experience that can be part of every moment of your day, that is really groundbreaking, that our worship will be conducted not by going to the special place or the special building, but that it's all around us. And moreover, that I like the combination there of spirit and truth, that in worshiping in the Spirit, there is something about that will push us to worship more truly. And I think especially, if you're someone in the audience, well, actually, I won't speak for anyone else. I'll say for myself. When I went through my whole deconstruction thing, when I encountered, Jewish thought and really wrestled with what my faith needed to be, there were a lot of practical conflicts that made church, at least the churches that I had available to me at that time, not really the places where I felt the most connected to God, not the most intimate spiritual places, and therefore didn't feel as worshipful. And what that did was it really clarified for me, what is the true heart of worship? What is the real inherent, like just rock solid, like this is what worship is. It's when I'm doing this. It's when I'm have this posture of my heart. And I think that the giving of the Spirit on Pentecost is like that it's kind of like a blank spiritual check. Like, you can do this even if you don't have a temple. You can go out. Hey, you have a language barrier? No, you don't. It doesn't matter. You can overcome that. You can become brothers with people who look nothing like you. Like, it is kind of the substance behind the idea of Jesus saying, like, hey, just go out into all the world. First, go to Judea and then go to Samaria, like, go to the other people and bring this to them. This can work not even just with Jews and Samaritans, but Jews and Gentiles. Go out everywhere and bring this. It kind of takes some of those limitations off. So I think that in a very real way, the giving of the Spirit was kind of like, to go back to like my parent analogy, it's a little bit like God saying, hey, almost like, don't hold me to this metaphor, but it's almost like we had our bar mitzvah, and now God's like, hey, you've grown up a little bit. humanity, I'm gonna let you get behind the wheel. I'm gonna let you have a little bit more control over your life now. I'm gonna let you have a say in what this worship looks like with the whole binding and loosing conversation. And that, even things Paul talk about that out of context can sound crazy, like all things are lawful. What the heck? Like, is that literally true? I mean, literally true or not, it is a new state of our relationship with God. So I think that's one thing where now the question of what obedience looks like is now something that we are given more authority to engage with ourselves. And as for the part of the question about like before or after Jesus's resurrection, to me, the abiding image of that, particularly from the gospel writer's point of view, where they're not just looking at it as like not just the idea of a messianic rabbi, which was, not Jesus was not the first person to put those ideas together. Like that was a pretty common thing in that day and age. Like the idea that Jesus is the incarnation of God, and that in order to instantiate your freedom from sin, God is willing to take on the wound. Like if we're using the sacrificial imagery, right, where an animal is dying as you're confessing your sins, underlying creating this image of like acknowledging that you have created a wound in the world that you can't undo. That animal's dead. It's not coming back to life. You sinned. Even if you make things right with someone, you can't unsay those words or undo those actions. They can heal, but there's going to be a scar. And then that carcass, that dead body, that reminder of the sin becomes elevated and lifted up onto the altar, and literally in the Torah, it says that anything that touches that altar becomes perfectly holy. Even if it was blemished and the priest didn't catch it and all that, it becomes holy. And it at the same time kind of becomes an act of worship, because there are a lot of sacrifices that are brought for just pure worshipful reasons, whether it's a peace offering or a mincha offering or offerings for the different festivals. Like that is a space of worship. And now your repentance just moves from you confronting the thing you did to God looking at you saying, this is how you worship me, by changing, by wanting to become like me. And then, ultimately it becomes a feast, and it becomes like the life we have in community. So when we pull that onto what Jesus did, like what drastically changes isn't just like, oh man, we got the most pure lamb ever. No, that's totally missing the image. Jesus isn't just a better lamb. Jesus is saying it wasn't even lambs. The lambs were a metaphor. The bulls were a metaphor. The goats were a metaphor. You know who actually bears the wounds of all your sin? God. Our sin hurts God, not because, like God is weak or something like that, but because God loves us. And when you love someone and they're hurting themselves or hurting other people, that sucks. That feels awful. You hate that. And on a just a very broad level, without getting into the nitty gritty of soteriology, Dylan, like I think what is being communicated, big picture in terms of us in our walk with God, is God is saying like, look, I can take it. I can take all of it. Your mistakes, your disobedience is not enough to drive me away. It can never kill our relationship. It can never kill me. And when you come back to me, now we're moving to the point in the sacrifice where it goes from being a dead animal to being an animal lifted up and becoming this worshipful act, which I think is paralleled with the resurrection. That there is actually new life when we allow our moments of disobedience, our moments of failure, moral failure and otherwise, to become moments where we are drawn back into God's presence, where we, and some of it is repentance, but a lot of times that repentance looks like us not running from pain or delusions about God that we have. So I think that with Jesus's sacrifice, to use your example here of loving your enemy, when Jesus just talks about loving your enemy, what are you looking at? You're looking at how he is engaging with the enemy, which would be Rome, right? Like your mortal enemy, your oppressor that walks among you and pushes idolatry on you and just makes your life a living hell constantly. And there is a difference in Jesus saying, like, look, this is how I'm willing to love the Romans. Like, I'm not holding this against them. Like when Jesus says, forgive them, they know not what they do. That wasn't just him talking about, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Like that was also Rome. Rome's the one that, there weren't any rabbis hammering nails into Jesus. So it shows how boundless God's love is. It proves it. It proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Because if Jesus didn't mean it, if God didn't mean it, then that wouldn't be how it was resolved. It resolved that way with God sacrificing himself, allowing himself to bear the wound, not because he's a helpless animal that doesn't know what's going on, but because God loves us so deeply that it's like, yes, see the wounds in me, know that you're hurting me, like your sin hurts me, and I need you to see that so you can accept the new life that I'm coming into. Because if you're stuck in this headspace where you think that, it's all transactional, it's all like you do a sin, you got to bring a goat, you do a sin, you got to bring a lamb. Like at some point, that is the childish version of the street is dangerous. I don't go in the street. If I go in the street, I don't get to, I don't know, have candy or something or my allowance. Like that was the less mature, more child-oriented message. And now he's saying, hey, you're big enough to know the reality, which is that I am the one bearing these wounds, not just the animal, not just in the ether, this thing. It's me. It's someone who looks exactly like you. I'm bearing the wounds. And you need to realize on both ends that that's who you're ultimately hurting. All our sin hurts God. But also that is how much God can withstand and forgive. And then that, when the Spirit comes, then is like the thing where it's like, hey, now that you have this knowledge and this increased awareness, you are now being given the reins more to now that you understand more deeply what's going on here when we're talking about obedience and disobedience. God isn't just some tyrant that's like, oh, let me give them another goofy rule, like wear a funky hat because I said so, or I'll kill you. Like that's not God's heart. And through Jesus, we begin to understand that, and we begin the process of figuring out, okay, what do we do with this? Honestly, this greater level of power and responsibility. And so in some ways, we've abused that and have, as Paul warned us about, used grace to allow us to sin more, to hurt and exploit more people, oftentimes in the name of God. But at the same time, it took humanity a while to receive Torah and learn how to really stick with that. And then we got Jesus. And now we are in the process of, like, kind of on another level of maturity, being able to not just follow Jesus' commands, but understand, what does it really mean to love my enemy in this context? Now, who do I actually see as my enemy? And especially in the world we live in today, like, especially if you're like me and live in America and have a relatively easy life, most of the people who we perceive as our enemies or feel like our enemies a lot of them we don't even see. A lot of them are just, I don't know, people on the internet or on the TV that we're mad at. Or maybe it's our boss or coworker or something. Like, who are actually our enemies? And so this is where I think now obedience, following Jesus's commands and teachings, requires a lot more engagement, a lot more critical thought, because it is, especially since, we're talking about, you know, 2000 plus years of historical context, and being halfway around the world. There's a lot of context changes, and I think that means the whole conversation about, what does obeying Jesus look like is a lot more challenging. And oh, it looks like Brent. Is this where we do the thing, Brent?
I'm breaking in. I'm breaking in. I thought we were going to get one more question in, but based on the length of the next one, I
You
think we
gave me
should
too much
probably
praise,
stop
and
now.
I thought I was safe.
I know I spoke too soon. I spoke too soon. Yeah, we just want to stop. We're almost at the top of the hour here. A couple follow-ups on your last question, though, actually. For people who
Mm,
do want to go deeper on soteriology, Marty just did a 5-part series on his YouTube channel. So if you're like, wait a second, Josh, I do want to know more about that, we've got a resource for that. So Marty's YouTube channel. A couple of the things you mentioned, you said there were a couple episodes in the John series where you talked about spirit. I was thinking of the John
yeah.
3 episode, which is 255. But were
Yes,
you
but
thinking of another episode as well?
there's also the John 6 two-parter that I did as the Redux, the first Redux that I know of.
Okay, yes,
That
that
one we
would be
also get heavy into the spirit.
286 and 287 on that. And then the binding and loosing conversation, that is going to be in session 4, episode 140. That one actually comes up quite a bit because we do actually skip that in session 3 when Peter does his confession. We say, hold that thought. We're going to get to it later. So for anyone who's in session 3 and they're like, when are you going to get to that? It's actually pretty soon. It's in Acts, early session 4. So episode 140 is where that was coming from. But yeah, we just want to stop for a moment and just say thank you to all the people who support Bama and support what we're doing. And I'm 4.5 years in on this journey as a paid ministry worker in Bama, and a surprising 11 years into my Bama journey in general, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, we just continue
Wow.
to be blessed by so many supporters, who have not only enabled me to do this work full time, but have brought on other teaching voices, which have been so valuable to have Josh among them. But to have these different perspectives and these different ways of thinking about things and different life experiences to bring to the teaching material, like Josh was just saying on his John 6 episodes. I think it was a conversation with me and Marty and Reed talking about John 6, and Reed had this whole perspective of the passage, and Josh came in and said, I've got something that I really enjoy about that passage as well, from a totally different angle, totally different thing to talk about. It's like, well, that's great. That ability to look at things from many perspectives and just take as much meaning as we can out of the scriptures, is a huge blessing. And then in addition to the people who are on the podcast, who are more public, we have a handful of people who are working on Baymoss stuff behind the scenes, doing design work and editing and um, different elements of audio production and just coordinating all of the things. Like I'm pretty sure Brian's still watching. I saw him comment earlier. He uh, he makes all the gears run smoothly. He is the oil in the Baymo machine, and
Oh
so
yeah.
all of that stuff is enabled by your guys' generosity. So we just always want to take the opportunity to say thank you for that, because it just continues to be this wonderfully rich blessing to be a part of this and have so many people who are willing to jump in with us and say, you know what, I don't get all of it either, and I'm willing to sit in the tension and ask questions, and not only ask questions, but ask questions that are just going to lead to more questions, even if I get an answer on the first one. So it is this journey that we're all on together. So yeah, thank you all for being a part of it. So with that,
Yes.
Josh, I'll let you get back to the questions.
Okay. I shall. So this next one, this is a pre-collected one from about 6 months ago. This is from someone named Davy or Davi. I hope I'm saying that right. Who is a pediatric orthopedic surgeon from Belo Horizonte, Brazil. Sounds amazing. And yeah, thank you for sending in this question, especially with the language barrier. That's, man, talk about things that I have not had. Well, I guess I've had to struggle with that a little bit because so much of the rabbinic stuff is in Hebrew. But anyway, that is good on you for sticking with this despite that difficulty. So here's the thing. I cannot read all of this because Davi sent me this, or rather, he sent us, not me specifically, but he sent us like this whole uh, Pardis exercise, specifically for the parable of the wheat and weeds in Matthew 13. And, for those who maybe aren't familiar with it, a guy has a field, an enemy comes in at night and sows in some weeds. I've heard a lot of teachings on this. One in particular that I like is that apparently the specific kind of weeds that were planted would have looked very much like the wheat, and you wouldn't be able to tell until they were fruiting. So kind of a very sneaky sabotage perpetrated. And the servants see this and they say, "Oh, what the heck? Who did this? You planted good seed. Someone else must have snuck in here and planted some really bad seed. Let's uproot all of the bad ones." And the owner says, "No, don't do that because you might damage the good grain. We'll just pull it all up at harvest and separate it then." Now, man, Davi has too many interesting things here to say all of them. But the big idea, he connects this to the laws of kilaim, which is Hebrew. It means mixture. So in Leviticus, I think it's chapter 19. There is 19. There is a run of a couple commandments about different types of mixtures that are prohibited. So this is where you get the not having multiple kinds of fiber in your clothing, not having animal breeds mixing, or even working different animals at the same time. And for this one, this parable in particular, a lot about not planting your field with two kinds of seed. And it looks like Davi did pretty, some amount of research here. There's multiple hyperlinks. This is so in general, Davi, I just want to applaud you for how much you've dug in here. This is great. Ultimately, he connects this with Judges, where Samson is angry at an injustice, and so what does he do? He ties the torches to the tails of the foxes, has them run through the field, and destroys the whole field. Just kind of the polar opposite of what Jesus does. And Davi ultimately talks about this in terms of the church and are sometimes I'm assuming this is what Davi was thinking. I'll speak a little bit for Davi, but in our hurry to pull out the weeds, oftentimes we damage the wheat. Now I have a little bit of a there's a couple things where at least for the rabbinic conversation of kilaim, of the laws of mixture, this doesn't quite fit because the law of kilaim is primarily about overworking the land, big picture. But specifically, like if you get deep into the rabbinic laws in the Talmud, they talk about how technically it's not, the issue is that you don't plant two different seeds in your field, which that isn't what happened here. Someone else came in and planted the second seed. And also it has to do with the fruit that comes out of them. And the second type of plant that was produced isn't a fruit bearing plant. It's a weed. It's not, you're not getting anything out of it. But I just, I don't really want to make this a downer other than in terms of like shooting this down. Um, and I think actually this kind of dovetails really well with what we were just talking about, where, with Jesus's parable, it kind of, if we are taking the kilaim, the laws of mixture lens, we would kind of have to look at this situation and say, like, yeah, maybe, you could see the situation, and like the servants, because of this law in Torah, you might be quick with your trigger finger to be like, oh, that's Torah says we can't do that. We can't do that. We got to stop that. We got to uproot all this. And that is, at least as how I understand it, that isn't actually what the Torah is saying to do for this specific situation. And the bigger point that Jesus is making as he explains more of what the parable means is that, in being quick to judge in this sense, the real issue is not even this like ticky-tacky debate of technicality, but more importantly, what is being harmed, what is being lost as we do this. And man, yeah, there's so many little pieces here I wish I could pull out. I wish I could just show you all this wonderful work that Davi did. This is literally like 5 or 6 paragraphs. We get some remez and drash and pashat. It's great. So most of all, Davi, great digging. Well done. Things are always a little tricky when you get into not just Torah law, but especially with a rabbinic conversation. So I would just say, like, and hey, I also might be wrong in what I'm saying here. You might be onto some solid gold, but definitely the way that you're engaging with the text, the way that you're pulling from multiple sources and really just following everything up, that's great. Well done. Would that every Bama listener had this kind of faith. All right. Oh, yes, this question. Okay. This question is coming to us from Carol, specifically on Bema episode 115, 5 loaves, 2 fish, and 1 big lesson. And man, this I'm just going to read this whole thing. This is a little bit of a longer one, but stick with me here, because I don't want to paraphrase this. Carol writes rather well. Let me take a sip of my tea and honey. Okay, there we go. Just a comment as an observant mother who has spent 40 years feeding her family and friends. I wonder whether this story was more to do with the wisdom of Jesus, and that in itself was the miracle. When we go to my daughters to eat, usually a table of 10, I have noticed how everyone thinks of the group at large and self-services smaller portions than they would normally eat. Consequently, there's always some leftovers in the main dish. Today, we are used to self-service via the many accessible fast food outlets, but in the previous generation, people rarely went a distance without taking some food with them, i.e. cheese, bread, and dried goods. I suspect that of the large crowd that came out to listen to Jesus, some would have brought some food with them, some not so. And the boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fish, who would have baked the bread, etc., and placed it in his sack, possibly like others in the crowd, his mother, as he ran out the door. Was he a servant boy carrying the bread especially for the disciples? We don't know. So let us imagine the crowd that came all that way to hear was a caring crowd, a people used to giving and supporting and sharing within their community. And as the baskets were passed around, I can well imagine the hungry taking what they needed, while those who had thoughtfully brought their own food would have placed all extraneous to their immediate needs into the basket. And Jesus knew this would happen. It was a simple and disciplined way of sharing what was available. So, Carol, wherever you are, whoever you are, I hope you're listening right now. Carol, I love you. I love this. I really love this kind of inventive reading. I love this for a lot of reasons, but I'll start by saying that I think you know some people who might be watching this stream right now might tense up a little bit at us taking this moment from the Gospels and sucking the miracle out of it and saying, hey, what if there was no miracle? What if there just was enough food and people shared and there was enough, even though if you looked around, you wouldn't have thought there was enough food. There was still enough hidden in there. Maybe at first glance that doesn't jibe with you or whatever, but here's what I love about this. A lot of times when we think about God and miracles in the present day, it's something that we feel cut off from, something that we don't have access to, something that if it ever happens very rarely. And there's all sorts of theological debates like pulling apart the specifics of the why and the when and the how and the what. And I feel like that really draws us away from why we have these stories. This isn't just a like, well, back in the day you could do magic and now there's no magic anymore. Like that's just kind of a lot of times what we're left with when we have the conversation from that frame. So a long time ago, I won't go into the whole story because there's a lot of stuff I would have to explain, but there was a moment where God really challenged me to consider not the question of do miracles happen or not? Is the supernatural real? Is it all a metaphor or not? But rather, okay, let's just say miracles happen. What kind of miracles does God care about? Like, famously Jesus said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can tell this mountain move and it'll move. Now, do you think the kind of miracles, if we were, like we were just talking about, if we were really pursuing being like God, being like our parent, becoming more like them, and we had, with just the teeniest bit of faith, we had all this power, do you think God would be happy if we were like, yo, check this out, I'm just going to move this mountain and rewrite every map? How cool is that? Like, do you think that even moves the needle for God? Like, would that make God proud of us if we just, moved a bunch of dirt? Like, I don't think so. I don't think that's the kind of miracle God wants. And you know what? I think if we can achieve a miracle without any magic happening, to be very reductive, without anything supernatural occurring, I don't think God cares about that part. I think the miracle of, say, breaking a generational curse in your family or reconciling with someone after a long period of time, like, those are moments that when I've been privileged to experience them, they feel genuinely miraculous. They feel like I thought this was impossible, but it's happening. And so first of all, I applaud Carol for bringing that to this story, because I never really saw that in this story. There's such a focus on the numbers and the multiplication. But I really love this idea that, like, yeah, people had little snacks packed, they had a little, and everyone thought like, oh, there's probably not enough. I only have like enough for me. But then when they actually took what they need and donated the rest, there was enough to feed everyone. Like, that would be so cool. Like, if that happened to you, if you were out in the wilderness because you and a bunch of people felt like God just called you out there, and all of a sudden everyone's stomach starts growling, and you ask people like, hey, did anyone bring food? And everyone's like, no, not really, I just brought snacks, not that much. And then you like pulled it all out and it happened to be just enough, and there was like, I don't know, 7 grapes left over. You would look at those 7 grapes, you'd be like, oh my God, 7 grapes, the perfect number. Like, look at how God multiplied what we have. Like you would have that sense of something miraculous, something profound happening, and it doesn't have to have been literally supernatural to do it. That's like, if we're thinking about it like that, we're kind of more interested in winning a debate with an atheist than we are actually being present to what God is doing in our midst. So that's one aspect I like of it. Here's the other aspect I like about it. So this is something that has been like the heartbeat of my ministry that I've been building. So when I was a kid, there was this book that I read called Stone Soup. Some people, I thought it was like a big book for me as a kid. So I assumed like everyone had read it. Um, I thought it was like a folktale, like Goldilocks or something like that. So I was really surprised. A lot of people don't know about Stone Soup, but it's great. I love this story. It's so kingdom. I'll tell a very brief version of it. You'll catch on quick. So a guy walks into a town, and it's a little village. This is a fairy tale, right? He walks into a little village, a little hamlet. Let's say he walks into this hamlet, and he goes into the little village square, the hamlet square, rather. Pardon me. Uh, and he looks around and he goes up to someone who's carrying a big pot, and he says, "Excuse me, could I borrow your pot? I'm trying to make some stone soup. If you let me borrow it, I'll share some of my soup with you." The guy says, "What, stone soup? What's that?" The guy pulls a stone out of his pocket. He says, "Look here. Here's the stone. Let's see. Here we go. Here is the stone. I'm gonna make soup with it." The guy's like, "Well, I gotta see this. Yeah, I'm not using my pot. Yeah, you can take this this pot. Let's see what happens." He's like, "Okay, well, we need some fire, obviously, to make the soup." So they find someone who's, making a fire. The same proposition. "Hey, I'm looking to make a stone soup. Can I make it over your fire?" Guy says, "Sure, got to see this." Then, he says, "Oh, wait, we need some water for the soup." Of course, all soups need water. That's like the main thing soup is. So they notice someone carrying water. They say, "Hey, can we have some of your water? We're making stone soup." These people have gathered around. They're interested. And then they get the water going. It's boiling. He drops the rock in, and everyone's waiting there. They're sitting around. They're like, "Is it ready yet?" And he says, "Not yet. Not yet. It takes a little while." And then a woman walks by. She's just come from her garden. She's carrying a bunch of carrots and onions. And she asks, like, "Hey, what are you making here? What's going on?" They tell her the whole thing about stone soup. She says, "Well, I had a great crop this year. I have way more carrots and onions than I need. Would you like an extra couple carrots and an onion?" The guy says, "Sure, that'll go great in my stone soup." So they throw that in. And maybe you all are getting the picture now. This goes on and on until they have a wonderful soup, and the whole community is gathered around it. Everyone's contributed a little something, and boom, there you have it, stone soup. Now, what I love to think about in this is that what is the stone's job in stone soup? It's not actually, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's some kind of special rock, maybe there's some salt crystals in it or something. But by and large, this stone is not actually doing anything for the soup on a practical material level. It's just sitting there in the soup. But the whole thing would not exist but for the stone, but for here, let me pull it back out again. The stone, this beautiful little weird nonsensical excuse to gather everyone around and make soup with. So in one sense, the stone doesn't do anything for the soup. In the other sense, the soup would not exist without the stone. And to me, like, that is the best explanation, not like a theological definition of the spirit or God's presence, but that is, I think, how spiritual practices and how, especially with things like hospitality oriented things, but really any spiritual practice, this is the best description of what that process looks like. Again, not a definition, not saying, "Oh, the spirit is just fake and it's a metaphor for humanity hanging out." No, not at all. Not at all. God's real. The spirit's real. But in terms of how we engage with it, I think that this is how kingdom happens. We have this little stone in the center of it that reminds us all to gather around and to wonder at it and look and curiously be like, oh, what could this turn into? And that's how we find that we have enough the whole time. The miracle is not us, magicking more bread than everyone actually had. It's us realizing that when we fully embrace generosity, when we just really lean into it, when we are open-handed with our community and other people, when we are generous with our love and are more interested in, like Carol said in her thing, people who are just open to sharing. Like, it's the guy who has 2 Snickers in his pack and says, oh, I have half a Snickers. Like, that's the guy who's not really going to enjoy the stone soup, not because it's going to be any less nutritious or anything, but because he didn't get to participate in the generosity of it. And the people who are generous with it then get to marvel at how their little contribution became this, like, not beautiful magical soup, but a beautiful shared moment of community. And that is genuinely miraculous and God fueled. It is part of how we incarnate God and be the body. So I love that. I can't gush enough about this, but I will stop myself. Thank you, Carol.
Well, you're not
All right.
alone. In the book, Josh, Lisa and Clarine on Facebook have expressed admiration for the story or the book. And then I don't know if Dave has read it, but Dave on YouTube says, I want to eat that soup. Oh no, he says, I
Oh, I
still want
know,
to eat
right?
that soup. So I guess he is familiar with the story. So you're not alone.
Yes. If it's the same book I read, there were some really good drawing illustrations in it. It looked really delicious, man.
Someday, maybe you'll have to make it. Josh, by the
Someday.
way, you and your wife are pretty handy in the kitchen. You guys like to cook.
Mm.
Fun fact about
Oh yeah.
Josh.
Oh yeah. I'm a great cook, and I love doing it too.
Absolutely. Okay, just throwing those
Mm.
in.
Thank you. Love it. Love to hear it. Yeah, everyone go out, buy, especially if you have a kid, go buy Stone Soup or something. It's a good book. It's a good parable. I wish I knew who invented it. Anywho, all right. Next question. This is coming to us from Bryson. And Bryson's question, I'll just read the first part here. A few of my brothers and I have been discussing God's ruach, which is the Hebrew word for spirit or breath or wind. But in the context of this question, ruach is spirit. I was hoping you could weigh in on the conversation by responding to some questions we have. According to Jesus, his Talmudim in the New Testament, is God's Ruach the same in the New Testament as the Old Testament? And then there's a bunch of questions that follow that are put in various different ways in terms of, like, does the Spirit act or work in ways that are different? How does it work? Old Testament versus New Testament. Is it natural or ordinary? And in fact, that question I really, really like. And so in general, I would say just a simple, plain yes. It is the same spirit. I think it largely works in the same ways. Oh, and actually, Dylan, your question earlier has been setting up a lot of these things. That was a great and beautifully timed question too. Thank you, Brent and Dylan. Because I think that in one sense, the way that the spirits worked, I guess on some level changes, but I think it changes as a function of it's responding to us. It's engaging with us. In fact, I probably shouldn't say it. I should say she, because ruach is a feminine word in the Hebrew. So the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, um, she's always been around. She's able to engage with us in all of these ways. Did it change Old Testament to New Testament? Uh, in a way, but it's more, I think, reflective of a change in us and in how God's story continues to grow and mature and evolve as we, as we uh, grow in our ability to have these conversations. Um, there are new questions that we're having and new problems that we're having to deal with, which I hear about this a lot, especially working with college students, where things I don't know, global warming or other kind of systemic issues, how would, or people who are concerned about animal rights and the cruelty in the way that we make food in the large scale, like those are all way bigger questions, way bigger issues of justice than we could have imagined 1,000 years ago. Kind of the closest thing to that, I guess, would be making treaties with other nations or things like that. But even that's small scale compared to some of those issues. Um, so just in a very practical sense, not even delving into anything spiritual, are the kind of similar to parents, you see different sides of your parents as you get older, and some of that is they're going to act differently because now you're older, but also some of it is as you get older you're able to process and understand more things. We've had collectively way more time with God than at any other point in human history, just because we're at the moment we're at. And maybe skip forward another 1,000 years and humanity's figured out how to just I don't know, zap food into existence, and it's oh yeah, now those old questions about hunger and taking care of the poor aren't quite the same, because at that point I don't think we're going to run out of ways to get closer to God, or spiritual questions, or even justice questions that need answering. We just cannot conceive of them now because they're so outside our context. Um, but the one question I really like from this, I think is very incisive, Bryson, is does God's Ruach work through natural and ordinary ways as well as miraculous ways? And that's where I would say a resounding yes, at least the way we would frame that in kind of our Western context. I do not think it is exclusively just happen to the spirit's just like some wandering fairy and she just sprinkles miracles on the good little boys and girls who deserve it. I think it is I think Jesus says it best when he's talking to Nicodemus, where he's just it's like the wind. You don't know where it's coming from, you don't know where it's going. We genuinely cannot predict how the spirit is going to engage at any point. And we talk about this a lot, when um when we get into the nitty gritty of spiritual disciplines, if you have a big prayer practice, for some people, a lot of that revolves around um, making requests and keeping track of how God answered those requests. Now, I'll tell you, having been in church literally my whole life, and seeing how people interpret God's answers or not answers, I don't think every single one of them, God is playing 5D chess and is every trajectory of every atom is being tinkered with so that something happens differently. I think genuinely, um, again, not taking the miraculous off the table, but um, if the thing that the spirit does is just tap us on the shoulder and be hey, take a deep breath, and we take a deep breath and now we're a little calmer, and then the next conversation we have goes a little bit differently than it might have otherwise, is that a miracle? It kind of challenges our Western concept of that, because it's well, the spirit's there. If there wasn't this spiritual intervention, maybe things would have gone differently. But it happened through a totally natural process. All I did was take a couple deep breaths and calm down, and say something kind rather than something, out of anger, or, something as simple as that. Like, that's where I think not only is it important to, like, have a more accurate theology of that, but both to, like, have that relationship with God and the Spirit be more alive and present. Because I don't know about all of you, but I mean, even just in the basic imagery and terminology, the Spirit is way less tangible than Jesus. And so I think, especially, living post Jesus and knowing that God was a dude who walked around, who had a tangible body, who experienced everything about being human. Like, now we have uh, uh, a spirit that we can't touch or taste or smell or see or any of that. And so whatever we can do for ourselves to, like, help bolster our faith and have that relationship be more alive in the way we experience the world, the better. And so that's where, like, I don't think there's any danger in us. Um, well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe we can over ascribe things to the Spirit, but in general, I think being willing to see the Spirit even in things that are totally natural and ordinary. And, if we weren't people of faith, we could just call it coincidence, or we could just call it like, hey, I made the right decision at the right time. Like, yeah, maybe it's that, but I think that is the Spirit. And I think when we use that lens, then uh, what happens is that we become more attuned to what is happening rather than why it's happening, or you get lost in some of the theological questions behind that. I don't think, I don't think the Spirit came so that we could iron out a perfect theology. The Jesus' final words were always about action. And yeah, again, like, the Spirit kind of, in a lot of ways, works as a big blank check. Like, yeah, worship in spirit and truth. It can be anywhere. It can be with anyone. It doesn't have to be at the temple. It doesn't have to be in Jerusalem with a bunch of other Jews. It can be out in the middle of Asia, walking through Turkey, meeting a random Ethiopian eunuch on the side of the road. Like, the Spirit is going to do wild stuff, and it doesn't have to be complicated, I guess. Anyway, I could ramble about that for a while. I'm going to cut myself off. I was a bit of a ramble. Oh my gosh, rambling.
Well, so Irish had a comment. She said, I've been diving deep on Ruach since Reed's topic on Psalm 51 and then Psalm 32. So Irish is someone who's caught up to current because Psalm 32 is the most recent episode. But
Wonderful.
coming this week, I'm talking to Reed about Psalm 19, and then we're also recording an additional episode on Psalm 23. So Josh had his Psalm 23 conversation with Reed a few weeks ago, and then Elle stepped in and said, aha, I have some other thoughts. So Elle's going to come on and talk to Josh and present a few different ideas. And we're going to have an
Uh,
extra conversation on Psalm 23, which is great. So the Psalms
yeah,
continue.
I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah, and genuinely, I like, to be a little transparent here. I think, to piggyback on the conversation I had earlier about, like, the timing of when Jesus came. Like, there's so much at Pentecost. I mean, literally, Pentecost is a Hebrew holiday, Shavuot, where they got the Torah, and we went from being given the Torah at Sinai to having the Torah embodied. And it's just like, man, I think one day in the future, hopefully in the near future, we'll really nail this Spirit thing. And then what will happen after that? What will God send our way after that? I have no clue. And it's really exciting. Um, anyway, thanks for
Yeah,
breaking into
absolutely.
that. Yeah, I could talk about the Spirit for a while. Man, oh man. But we must go on. Other people have questions. Kelvin says, I was listening to an episode, and the next day something clicked for me. The language of eternal life and never needing anything else sounds a lot like being in the garden. eating the flesh and drinking the blood to gain eternal life sounds like what we would do if you think of the fruit and the tree of life, flesh being the skin and the fruit and blood being the juice. Yeah, in general, Kelvin, I think that really tracks. I would just give it a thumbs up. Yeah. And well, I could probably say more about that, but in general, I think that's a great connection. Whew, oh my gosh. Was that a record for most to the point answer yet? We'll see. Next question. Oh, look at this. From Joshua. My goodness. Hello, fellow Josh. I'm listening back through Matthew in season 3 as our church is spending a couple months on the Sermon of the Mount, and the Bible Project is spending a year. Marty mentions the last 2 Beatitudes and focuses more on the second, persecution. So, of course, with the Beatitudes at the very end, we have persecution mentioned twice. And that seems to be what Josh is commenting on here. I've been thinking a lot about the first persecution in light of the theme of Matthew and the backwards, outcast, upside down kingdom. And I have a different thought about the first stanza of persecution. And Josh goes on to say a couple of things, but is basically wondering if these 2 invocations of persecution are talking about 2 different levels of persecution or 2 different, I guess you could call them systems of persecution. The first being that of the Pharisees kind of overzealously persecuting the sinners in their community, and the lack of compassion they had for those people, and that the other persecution is like the direct persecution of Rome. And with the like slightly different wording on those, I could see that. I'm not gonna I do have a different reading on that I'll explain in a second. But in general, I don't think that's a totally bad approach. I would be curious as to how that works for the larger kind of stitching together of teachings we see in that Matthew 5 thing. Because, we have a Sermon on the Mount's just, it's friggin' huge. It goes on and on and on. And very likely is not something Jesus actually said all in one go. I mean, there's that one sermon that he taught where he just reads Isaiah and then says like, yep, and you've seen it fulfilled just now. And that's the whole sermon. That's how most rabbis usually teach. Very like short, profound little snippets. So this whole long stretching, like longer than even a sermon at a modern church, like probably not said all at once, which means that Matthew is kind of stitching these teachings together as like Jesus's main thesis. Because this is Matthew 5 is like the first time we actually hear Jesus teach anything at all in Matthew. So it's a really big, important moment. So anyway, to wind this all back to the Beatitudes, I have a different understanding of why persecution is mentioned twice that I'll lay out here, and hopefully it will help. But again, Josh, the other Josh out there, this is not me poo-pooing your idea, but I'll explain it. So to me, when I look at the Beatitudes, the first thing that jumps out to me is there's a dang chiasm here. Oh shoot, what was my new? Oh no, well, I coined a new phrase that is legally
Huff
distinct from
that
Marty's.
chiasm.
That's right, huff that chiasm. Uh, yes, the chiasm is a little bag, and you huff all the stuff out of it. I don't know if that's how you huff things. Anywho, so if you look at the Beatitudes, you look at verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And if you mosey on down to verse 10, what does it say? Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, those both end the exact same. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. to me, it's that was like ding, ding, ding. There's a chiasm there. I have a wonderful teaching that I really like. It's probably one of the first teachings that I actually wrote out. And in fact, I think that might be the first time, the secret time I appeared on the podcast, because Marty used some of that teaching for one of his session 3 episodes, the one where he talks about the Beatitudes. Although he takes it in a different direction than me, and one day I will record my own episode on this and share the whole teaching. But basically, this whole chunk is a chiasm. So then we might be asking, well, then what the heck is going on in verse 11 that is outside the chiasm, but we still have the initial blessed at the beginning? Here's where I'm going to point you to all the other things that are wrong, because all through here we see blessed are, blessed are, blessed are the X. Here in verse 11, what do we see? Blessed are you. Total pivot. Now, it's still maintaining the blessed structure, because I think Matthew this is a transition to a different teaching, and he is trying to signal to us that we're carrying the same idea forward. And instead of the kind of contrast being drawn across each side of this chiasm, now he takes the last bit of the end bookmark of that chiasm and says, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. And if I read your comment on this correctly, Josh, you're saying that this second invocation of persecution is the one about the Pharisees, because in the first one talks about being persecuted for the sake of righteousness, but the Pharisees aren't persecuting sinners because they're righteous. If I'm understanding this correctly. But I would, and there is something there. Like the second persecution, it talks about people like, insulting you and lying about you, like, probably decidedly less intense than what Roman persecution was like. But instead, this line, this verse 11, gets kind of wrapped into verse 12, where he says, rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in this same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, this is taking that idea of persecution and not digging in deeper and doing this chiastic thing. It's kind of rolling it into, like, it puts your persecution in a context of, like, people have been persecuting the prophets since forever. Your current persecution is part of a legacy, a lineage of people who are trying to be faithful to God, even when it cuts against the culture that is prevalent, especially the culture around God and people who follow God. And then that goes into this idea of salt of the earth. And to just cut to the chase, that I'm pretty sure the thesis of this chiasm is Jesus is trying to redefine the way community works with regards to righteousness. Like there is a new definition for what righteousness looks like, and it has a very different orientation. And I think that's why all of this whole chiasm is talking about, like, kind of this reward, like these people are blessed with this reward, these people are blessed with this reward. And ultimately he's building up to this idea that righteousness works totally differently than we like to conceive of it. And that's why this idea of persecution ends up becoming the thing that kind of propels the conversation out of this narrow idea of what is righteousness to the practical questions of how does that look in the world and in conflict, in difficult to discern situations, in circumstances that are trying and make these questions more complicated. Okay. Wonderful. Great. I think that was it. I could go on, of course. but I'll just give you all an episode one of these days. Yeah, what's up,
Okay,
Brent?
Josh. I'm I can't believe that I'm warming to the idea of huffing chiasms. But as you said, I don't know if that's how you huff something. I was like, okay, well, what are we talking about anyway? First of all, huff as an inhalation is a North American informal term. So it's 8 a.m. in Australia right now. If we have anybody tuning in from Australia, they might be completely unfamiliar with this term. But it
Mm,
is the inhalation of fumes from something like gasoline or whatever, for, euphoric effects.
yeah.
Setting that aside, inhalation of something that has fumes, and to do so, I don't think you have to do a funnel system or anything like that. So I don't know if the structure of a chiasm in that way necessarily. But if you want it to work, you have to be as close as possible to the source. And so if we want to
Mhm.
understand chiasms, being as close as possible to the text is going to be the most effective way of doing it. So I cannot believe that I am
There
actually
we
warming
go.
to this idea, but
Yes,
and then
Brent.
Dave commented, he's referring back, said this is the crudeness I'm looking for. Huff that chiasm.
Yes. Well, you're welcome to it, Dave. It's pretty much a nonstop flow over here at the Boss A house. Yes, huff that chiasm. We love it. This is big. This is going to be big. I think this is going to be big.
I, I mean, I don't know about
Oh
that, but I'm at least more on board than I was before. We do
man.
have one more question though from another Josh, if you can believe it. There's
Yes,
another Josh.
we've got a triple portion of Josh's, which I'm patting myself on the back. That's a very funny joke, as you'll see when I read this question. Josh says, I'm curious if there has been any commentary on the response of Elisha when jeered at by kids about his baldness. They were mauled by bears. Which, first of all, I got to say, Josh, that's some great comedic writing there. Just leading up to it, and then just the simple sentence: "They were mauled by bears." Wonderful. I giggled when I first read this. It was great. Um, Number one, Josh asks, what am I missing? Any context? Should I focus on the numbers 42 and two bears? The word boys is jarring for me to read with mauled, which that's good. That is good. All of us should be worried about boys being mauled. More on that in a second. Part two, Josh asked, traditional American church interpretation usually paints this story to uh, be about respect of the older members and specifically of God's prophet. I find this explanation to be lacking and very simple, potentially a great one to grasp for moralistic teachers, though I recognize honoring our elders is not solely a Western or modern ideal. Any thoughts or pointers? And oh boy, Josh, this is right over the plate. It's nice and slow. I loved seeing this. This was uh, oh man, this is tied with Carol for my favorite question. Okay, so this is something I dug into a while ago, years and years and years ago. And I don't say this to brag, but I think I have fully cracked this question. Um, I'm surprised. I was really surprised because I didn't see any rabbinic commentaries that pointed out the detail I'm about to pull out. Um, but it's right there in the Hebrew. Okay, so let me go through Josh's question before I just get all excited about my own teaching. Okay, so there is some context here, Josh, that will be very important. But before we get to that, um, the thing about the numbers, I think it's because it's 42, either 42 young men who were mauled or 42 young men in total, and the two bears. That is a great question. I don't necessarily know about the number 42. And one is in particular kind of troublesome because I don't know about anyone else, but like I read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when I was a young man. So 42, my brain just like has associations with it. So it's a little bit hard to think about it in biblical terms, especially because I don't know, biblical numerology is always very tricky. Now, the two bears might be something because, as you may know, this. So yeah, let's set up context. That would be a great thing. Context. So this is happening shortly after the ascending of Elijah, and then Elisha kind of graduates to being the prophet, the dude. And one of the things, I think it's the last thing that I might be mixing this detail up, so forgive me, all of you out there, if this is incorrect. But I'm pretty sure this is the moment where Elijah asks Elisha if he has he's like, ask me something before God takes me up. And Elisha says, give me a double portion of your spirit. And so I wonder if the two bears might be a reference to that. The rabbis and many academics note that there are, I think, it's either 7 or 8. I think it might be 8. That Elijah does 8 distinct miracles and Elisha does 16, or he does double whatever Elijah does, is the point. And there's also a lot of similarities and like clear parallels and parallelisms between the miracles that Elijah did and the miracles that Elisha did. And if you compare the two, it jumps out of the page at you. So yeah, so the bear number might be important. The number of the young men, like that could be it. Yeah, okay. So I'm looking at it now. 42 of the young men were mauled, or in the NASB were tore up. Okay, so here's the most important context. So as I said, this is same chapter as Elijah being taken up, a scant, less than 10 verses out from that. So Elijah ascends. Elisha is the only one there to witness it. And when he's like walking back to where is it? Jericho. He's walking back to Jericho, and there were a bunch of sons of prophets at Jericho, and they saw him and they said, "Oh my gosh, the spirit of Elijah has settled on Elisha." They've noticed this kind of passing on of the torch, and they come to him and they say, "Oh my goodness, we have a whole bunch of people at your disposal. We know that Elijah has departed, but who knows? Maybe God just moved him. Maybe God just put him, out in the desert or in some back alley. Like, we'll go out and search for them." And Elisha's like, "Don't. You're not going to find him." But the people are like, "Nah, I think we're going to go look for him just in case, Elisha. We're going to go look for him." And so we can see right off the bat that, Elijah's a pretty, he's a dude with a big presence. I think we can conclude that very concretely from the text, very solidly. And now that Elijah's there, I feel like I wouldn't say that Elijah is like a mild-mannered dude, but he certainly seems so standing next to Elijah. I'll say that much. So I don't know. Maybe that's part of the dynamic here, but it seems like the people are like, "Oh, hey, Elisha, that's cool. We're just gonna go check and see if Elijah is still here, because Elijah's the man, and you're just kind of a dude." Like, I don't know. It seems though, in general, like people are kind of a little bit not ready for Elijah to be gone. And anyway, of course, they don't find anyone. And they ask him to go up to cleanse the water of the city. And after this happens, he's traveling to another town. And this is where he becomes accosted by the boys. So we've already seen some people that are kind of not super welcoming of Elisha. When he's going up, let me scroll down in blue letter. Okay, there we go. Some young boys came out from the city. Now, we have to really quick stop on this As Josh pointed out, the word boys is a little bit, it kind of raises our eyebrows a little bit. Now, the word here in Hebrew, I'm going to double check this, is na'ar. Na'ar. And is the, oh no, that's the word for woods. Oh, interesting. Okay. That's a different word than I thought. Where's the previous one? Sorry for the silence ever. Okay, so in verse 23, it does specifically call them Na'ar. Now, Na'ar is kind of a tricky word because it isn't really correlated to age. It definitely will imply someone is younger, but that is because the word Na'ar is descriptive of a man who is like in a subservient position. So, like a rabbi would not be a Na'ar. A Talmud would be an R. So a great example of this is when it talks about Joshua before Moshe dies. Joshua is referred to as an R, even though he's like 40 something years old, because he is under Moshe. There's like a formal societal relationship that he is subservient to Moshe. So that is like the more technical side of it. When it's used kind of without context like this, it is a little trickier because they could be young men. We could imagine, college age, high school age, maybe. Like it's kind of variable. But I don't think the image is supposed to be a bunch of trash talking 9-year-olds. I do not think that's the image. And certainly not the point of the story for us. So, and I think that the reason why he's being confronted in this way and why they point out that these are young men rather than just people in general, like why use a specific word instead of just saying some people, some men, some whatever. I think this is, we can see this is kind of in parallel to the first encounter Elisha has, where the people go out, they're respectful towards him, kind of, but they don't listen to him, first of all, and specifically they're not listening to him so they could find his rabbi, his superior, which is really at the end of it disrespectful. They're not looking at him as the new Elijah. They're looking at him as like, oh, the substitute teacher almost. That's probably a good, at first he's treated like a substitute teacher. So here's where we come down to the meat of it. Is what do these young men call him? They call him bald. Is that really what the prophet of God is getting torn up about, being called bald? Okay, so this is where the real crux of it is. So if you look in the Hebrew, the word for bald is karach. And that might not mean much to y'all out there if you aren't familiar with Hebrew, but when I first saw this, especially at that time, I was reading Torah a ton, almost exclusively in Hebrew, and this jumped the heck out at me because there is a very important character whose name has the exact same spelling, different vowelization, same spelling, and that person is Korach. Now, you may still be scratching your head because Korach is not a huge, big-time Bible character, but he is very, very important in the Torah. He is the guy who staged a coup against Moshe. He was a Levite, and he said, well, Moshe, it's kind of convenient that out of all the Levites, only your brother gets to be priest. That's a little suspect. And we might be able to sympathize with that. But big picture, he was trying to usurp Moshe's power. So this paints a very different picture. If they're not saying go up Baldy, if they're instead saying go up Korach, which again in the Hebrew, in the original Hebrew, you would not be able to tell the difference without the later addition of vowels. These two things would look exactly the same. If they are just shouting at him, go up Korach, ascend Korach, that is, again, very disrespectful, but more than disrespectful. In fact, uh, especially if we're thinking of young men who, uh, in this context, could very well, it could be using the word na'ar to imply or to tell us like these are young men in their prime, like these are fighting age young men. It becomes more of a they are accusing him of basically trying to kill Elisha. They have just accused him of deposing Elisha, killing him, disposing of the body, whatever. You can use your imagination. But the thrust of it is they are just to his face saying, you are not a legitimate prophet of God. They are like accusing him of a crime and could very well be threatening violence, not so subtly, because they like, yeah, Korach and all the people who were with him died. Like some of them got swallowed up by the earth. This is when God makes the earth open up and swallow Korach and his conspirators. But they also brought out, because they were fighting over who got to be priests, they brought their own incense offerings, and a plague swept, or no, not a plague swept through. Fire went out and consumed them all. So these are very strong words, very, very strong words. They are saying that he is Korach, and this is why it is not so ridiculous that he that the response is for these bears to come out. Now, uh, uh, this curse that he levels at them, there's so many things in here that I haven't figured out, like what the 42 connect with. There's probably something specific, because they didn't have to tell us how many boys were I shouldn't say boys. I really shouldn't say boys. It was just right there on the screen in front of me. It doesn't mean we should like, they could have just said the bears came out and mauled the young men or whoever. But they do tell us 42 for a reason. My gut instinct would be to compare this with Elijah. So, for example, Elijah also has kind of a power contest with the king and with the prophets of Baal. Maybe 42 is connected to something in there. That would be interesting. 42 doesn't come up a ton. It's a very specific number. But my guess would be that it had something to do with the prophets of Baal, especially because immediately after this, like literally the next verse, he goes to Mount Carmel, which of course is where Elijah's big showdown with the Baal priesthood happens. So my guess is that they're paralleling those things. But yes, no, Elisha did not just haul off and ask God to murder a bunch of 9-year-olds because he was a little sensitive about his bald spot. No, this is more him defending himself from people who are threatening him and publicly accusing him of some very serious crimes. Booyah. And yeah, I think the whole reading of this about being about respecting your elder is not really all that compelling. Any other thoughts, Brent? Do we have any tags? Anyone have any burning questions? I see we're after 6. Maybe this is perfect
We
timing.
we are after 6. You pretty much nailed it, and we're done.
Heck
We've
yeah.
concluded this session of mining the mind of Josh Bosse.
Well, this was a lot of fun.
It was a great
Glad we
time.
did it. And thank
Clarine
you all
did,
for
did
hanging
just
with us.
comment specifically on this last question, saying thank you for sharing the information. his response so much more understandable. So good
Yes.
stuff, good times. Yeah, just closing thought, just a reminder that the next Q&A we'll have Marty back answering questions on May 16th. That's a Thursday. I don't know what the time is actually, but I don't need another time because who knows where you are and what time it will be. If you go to bamodiscipleship.com and go to the news page, if you actually click on the time, it will open up a whole web page that shows you a whole bunch of time zones around the world. So you can figure out whatever time that's going to be for you where you are. But I think that does it. So thanks for
Nice.
stepping in, Josh, and sharing
Love it.
your thoughts and your resources and the things that you've studied and your heart and everything else. So really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Free to do it, or love to do it.
Yeah, we'll have you back. I'm pretty sure. I don't think
Mhm.
anything I don't think anything went horribly awry here. So more to come from Josh. So thank you all for watching and joining us, asking your questions and wrestling with all of these biblical texts and these ideas and everything else. So we'll be back
Mhm.
in a month.
Shalom.